A man worth $3 billion lay rotting in a hospital room, and not a single person on earth genuinely cared whether he lived or died. His lawyers were already dividing his assets. His cousin had quietly hired a private attorney. His board of directors held emergency meetings about succession planning while his heart was still beating. Room 14 at St. Mary's Medical Center smelled like antiseptic and abandonment. Then, a tired nurse from the south side of Chicago walked in carrying gas station coffee and a broken umbrella. And somehow, against every odd that medicine and logic could stack against her, she brought him back. Like this video. Drop your city in the comments. Let's see how far this story travels. The stroke hit Ethan Mercer at 11:47 on a Wednesday night in November, and the cruelest part wasn't the pain. The cruelest part was that it happened in front of 12 people, and not one of them reached him before his head hit the marble floor of the 42nd floor conference room. He remembered the sensation later, much later, like a fuse burning inside his skull, fast and white-hot, traveling from somewhere behind his right eye down into the base of his neck. He remembered the sound of the window glass rattling from the wind outside. He remembered the faces turning toward him, mouths opening, someone's chair scraping backward. He remembered thinking, very clearly, and with the strange calm of a man watching a car accident from a distance, "This is happening to me." Then nothing. Absolutely, completely, terrifyingly nothing. The paramedics arrived in 6 minutes. By then, Ethan Mercer had stopped breathing twice. The emergency room at St. Mary's Medical Center was not prepared for a billionaire. Or rather, it was not prepared for the billionaire's people. Within 40 minutes of his arrival, 3 attorneys were stationed in the waiting room. 2 private security contractors stood outside the ER doors. A woman in a charcoal blazer who introduced herself only as corporate communications was on her phone in the parking garage, already crafting the press statement. Dr. Benjamin Hale, the neurologist on call that night, had worked at St. Mary's for 11 years. He had treated stroke victims of every age and background. He was not a man easily rattled, but when he reviewed the initial scans and walked out to speak to the family, there was no family. There was a cousin, a man named Vincent Mercer, mid-40s, expensive watch, the kind of tan you got from vacations rather than outdoor work. He stood up immediately when Dr. Hale approached, which might have seemed attentive if his first question hadn't been, "What are we looking at in terms of timeline?" Dr. Hale stopped walking. "I'm sorry?" "Recovery timeline," Vincent said. He straightened his jacket. "Or the other direction. Either way, I need to understand what we're dealing with." Dr. Hale looked at this man for a long moment. He had dealt with complicated family dynamics in crisis situations before. This felt different. This felt like something he couldn't quite name, but recognized instinctively the way you recognize a smell. "Your cousin has suffered a massive hemorrhagic stroke," Dr. Hale said carefully. "He's alive. He's in critical condition. We don't know yet how significant the damage is. We won't know for some time." "Weeks? Months?" "Mr. Mercer. Vincent." "Vincent?" Dr. Hale kept his voice neutral. "Your cousin may need long-term neurological care. Right now, our focus is stabilizing him. I'd strongly encourage you to contact his immediate family." "I am his immediate family." Vincent smiled with his teeth only. "His wife passed 4 years ago. His daughter is 7. I'm the closest adult relative he has." "A 7-year-old daughter." Dr. Hale thought about that for a moment. He thought about a little girl somewhere in this city, probably already asleep, who did not yet know that her father was lying 40 feet away from where he stood, machines doing the work his lungs had temporarily forgotten. "I'll keep you updated," Dr. Hale said, and walked back through the double doors before he could hear whatever Vincent said next. Ethan Mercer did not wake up that night. He didn't wake up the next morning, or the morning after that, or the week after that. He didn't wake up in December, when the first real snow of the season covered Chicago in 10 inches overnight, and the city ground to a chaotic halt. He didn't wake up in January, when the temperature dropped to 11 degrees, and the heating system on the 3rd floor of St. Mary's kept malfunctioning. He didn't wake up in February, when the media coverage, which had been breathless and constant at first, quietly, collectively moved on to the next story. Billionaire investor Ethan Mercer remains in coma following stroke. That headline ran for about 6 weeks before the clicks stopped, justifying the space. The machines kept beeping. The IV drips kept cycling. The room kept smelling like antiseptic, and the particular staleness of a space that sees very little natural light. Nobody came to sit with him. Vincent stopped by occasionally, always with an attorney present, always for less than 20 minutes. The corporate communications woman appeared twice, both times to photograph the room. Not Ethan, just the room, for reasons Dr. Hale didn't ask about and didn't want to know. A few of the executives who had been in the conference room the night of the stroke showed up in the first week, standing awkwardly near the door, not knowing where to look or what to say to a man who couldn't hear them anyway, or so they assumed. The floor nurses rotated through room 14 the way they rotated through every challenging assignment, with professionalism, with competence, and with the subtle but unmistakable emotional distance that long-term unconscious patients tended to generate. It wasn't callousness. It was self-preservation. You could only pour so much into a patient who gave nothing back before your own reserves started running dry. Most of them kept their visits to the clinical minimum. Check the vitals, adjust the lines, document, leave. Nobody talked to him. Amelia Torres had been a nurse at St. Mary's for 6 years, and in that time, she had developed a finely tuned internal alarm for bad assignments. The charge nurse, Sandra, had the particular look on her face when she approached Amelia on a Thursday morning in late February. A look that combined sympathy with the practiced briskness of someone who has already made the decision and is only now delivering the news. "I'm moving you to a long-term care assignment," Sandra said. "Third floor, room 14. Amelia was in the middle of charting and didn't look up immediately. "The coma patient? The rich guy?" "Ethan Mercer, yes." "I thought Delgado had that room." "Delgado requested a transfer, so did Park before her." Sandra set the reassignment paperwork on the counter beside Amelia's keyboard. "You'd be his primary." Now Amelia looked up. Sandra had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. "I know it's fine," Amelia said. She picked up the paperwork and scanned it. "What's his current status?" Sandra went through it. GCS scores, feeding tube, respiratory function, the twice-weekly neurological assessments that Dr. Hale conducted with the careful thoroughness of someone who refused to stop looking for something, even when there was nothing obvious to find. No significant changes in 7 months. Stable, but unresponsive. "He has a daughter," Amelia said. It wasn't a question. She'd read the coverage. 7 years old. She's with a nanny. There's a legal guardian arrangement while things are unresolved. Amelia set the paperwork down. She picked up her coffee, which was from the vending machine on the second floor and tasted like warm brown water, and she drank some of it. "Okay," she said. "I'll start this afternoon." Sandra nodded, clearly relieved. "Thank you, Amelia. Truly." "Stop thanking me. You act like I'm being sent to a war zone." "Some nurses feel like—" "He's a patient," Amelia said simply. "He needs care. That's the whole job." She went back to her chart. Sandra picked up the reassignment paperwork and walked away. Amelia finished her coffee, grimaced at the last sip the way she always did, and started mentally rearranging her afternoon schedule. She did not think about the billion-dollar fortune. She did not think about the media coverage or the corporate drama or the cousin with the expensive watch. She thought about a man lying alone in a room on the 3rd floor who hadn't heard a genuine human voice in 7 months. She thought that was probably a terrible way to exist. Room 14 was smaller than she expected. She'd imagined that someone with Ethan Mercer's resources would have been moved to a private suite, the kind with a window seat and a television mounted on the wall and maybe a couch for visitors. But the room was standard. Twin bed, standard monitoring equipment, a single window that looked out on the concrete wall of the adjacent building. The overhead light was harsh. Someone had taped a get well card to the wall near the door. It had been there long enough that the tape was yellowing at the corners, and the card itself had the generic quality of something purchased at a hospital gift shop by someone who didn't know what else to do. Ethan Mercer lay on the bed with the stillness of someone who has learned, at a cellular level, how to wait. He was thinner than his photographs. She'd looked him up. She wasn't going to pretend she hadn't. In the photos from his company's annual reports and the occasional profile piece, he'd been sharp-featured and alert. The kind of man who looked like he was always calculating something. In person, with the muscle tone gone and the monitors beeping their steady and different rhythm around him, he looked younger. He looked, she thought, like someone who was very tired and very far from home. She pulled the chair closer to the bed and sat down. "Hi," she said. My name is Amelia Torres. I'm going to be your nurse starting today. She paused. I know you probably can't hear me, but I'm going to talk anyway, because I personally would hate it if people just stood around me in silence while I was trying to get better. So you're going to have to deal with me. Nothing. The monitors beeped. The elevator's broken again, she continued, settling back in the chair. Third floor one, not the main one. It's been broken since January, which I'm told is a known issue that's been escalated to maintenance. I've been walking up 2 flights of stairs every morning for 6 weeks, and honestly, at this point, it might actually be improving my life. My knees disagree. She checked his IV lines while she talked, moving with the automatic efficiency of someone who has done this thousands of times. You have a daughter, she said more quietly. Sophie, right? 7 years old. She smoothed the blanket near his arm without quite thinking about it. Just a small adjustment, the kind of unconscious care you offered without deciding to. I read that you used to take her to the farmer's market on Saturdays. Apparently she has strong opinions about what vegetables are worth eating and which ones are not. Amelia looked at his face, completely still. For what it's worth, she sounds right. Most vegetables are not worth eating. But she stood up, collected her chart, and moved toward the door. Then she stopped and turned back. I'll be back tomorrow morning, she said. Same time. And I'll probably have more complaints about the elevator. She went out into the hallway. The monitors beeped on, unchanged. She kept her word. Every morning, Amelia arrived in room 14 with her terrible vending machine coffee and whatever was currently annoying her about the world, and she talked. She talked the way you talk to someone you were comfortable with. Not performing conversation, not filling silence to be polite, but actually talking, letting thoughts wander and double back, saying things out loud that she might not have bothered saying to anyone else. She talked about the commute. The red line had been delayed 40 minutes on a Tuesday because of a signal issue at Belmont, which was apparently Chicago Transit's all-purpose explanation for everything. She talked about her mother, Rosario, who was managing her diabetes but not always taking her medications at the right times, and who had a stubborn streak that made Amelia look easygoing by comparison. She talked about her younger brother Marco, who was 24 and working a warehouse job and whom she worried about in a low-level, constant way that she'd mostly learned to ignore. She talked about patients, without names, always without names, because Ethan Mercer couldn't pass anything along to anyone. She talked about the weird territorial dynamics of the nurses' station. She talked about a documentary she'd watched about deep-sea fish that had genuinely disturbed her sleep for 2 nights. She talked about his company. She'd read a few articles about Mercer Capital, the investment firm he'd built from a rented desk in a shared office space at 23, which had grown into something that managed assets nobody on Amelia's salary tier could really conceptualize. She'd read about his wife, Claire, who had died of an aggressive cancer 4 years ago when Sophie was 3. She'd read an interview he'd given 2 years before the stroke, in which a journalist had asked him what success felt like, and he'd been quiet for a moment before saying, like having more to protect and less time to protect it. She thought about that line sometimes. She would tell him about it occasionally. I read that interview you gave, the one in the Tribune. She'd be checking his catheter or adjusting his positioning, practical clinical work, talking like he was just someone who'd stopped by. The part where you said success felt like more to protect and less time. I've been thinking about that. I think that's the most honest thing I've read from a person in your position in a long time. Most people in that interview would have said something about impact or legacy. She paused. You said it like it scared you. The monitors beeped. It should, she said. It was Dr. Hale who first noticed she was doing something different. He arrived for his Tuesday morning assessment in early March to find Amelia sitting beside the bed with a small Bluetooth speaker on the windowsill, playing something soft and slow. A piano piece. Nothing she could have named if asked, just something instrumental she'd found on a playlist called Calm Focus at 2 a.m. when she couldn't sleep. Dr. Hale stood in the doorway for a moment. Nurse Torres. Dr. Hale. She stood immediately. Has there been any change in responsiveness since Friday's assessment? Nothing I could document, she said. But there are things I've been noticing that I'm not sure how to chart. She hesitated, which was not something she did often. His heart rate stabilizes when I come in. Not when any nurse comes in. I've compared. The monitors show a specific response when I enter the room, and twice this week his fingers moved when I was talking. Not a spasm, more like a response. Dr. Hale crossed the room and looked at the monitoring data. He was quiet for a long moment. You know how easy it is to see patterns that aren't there, he said, not dismissively, carefully. I know. Especially with patients like this, patients you spend a lot of time with. I know, she said again. I'm not telling you he's waking up. I'm telling you something is different from a month ago, and I can't account for it clinically. I thought you should know. Dr. Hale looked at the chart, then at Ethan, then at the small speaker on the windowsill. Keep doing whatever you're doing, he said finally. He wrote something in his notes. And chart everything you observe, even the things that feel too small. Everything. Already am, Amelia said. He nodded and left. Amelia sat back down. She turned the piano music up slightly. He doesn't think I'm crazy, she told Ethan. That's something. March became April. The floor radiators stopped making the terrible knocking sound they'd been making since January, which Amelia announced to room 14 as though delivering significant news. The knocking stopped, she said one morning. I don't know if they fixed it or if something inside the system just gave up, but either way it's quieter, and I'm taking that as a win. She'd started bringing things, small things, practical things. A better pillow for positioning his head. The hospital issue ones were functional, but thin, and she'd read enough about long-term care to know that small physical comforts could matter even when the patient showed no measurable response. She brought a photograph, one she'd printed from a news archive, a grainy but recognizable picture of Ethan at a community event 2 years before the stroke, Sophie on his shoulders, both of them grinning at something outside the frame. She taped it to the wall across from the bed where he would see it first if he ever opened his eyes. She was not thinking when. She was thinking if. But she put the photograph there anyway. The other nurses on the floor had stopped teasing her mostly. There had been a week in early March when the jokes were consistent enough to be slightly wearing. Torres is in there reading the coma guy a bedtime story again. But she'd neither confirmed nor denied anything, and eventually the novelty wore off. The only person who remained openly skeptical was a nurse named Derek, who had 12 years of critical care experience and a particular brand of world weariness that he deployed like a professional credential. You're burning yourself out, he told her one afternoon in the break room. I've seen it a dozen times. Nurse gets attached to a long-term unconscious patient, invests everything, patient either dies or wakes up and goes home and never thinks about you again. Either way, you end up empty. Amelia poured herself coffee. Real coffee this time, from the break room machine, which was marginally better than the vending machine. Thank you for the pep talk, Derek. I'm serious. I know you are. She turned around and leaned against the counter. And I'm not attached. I'm doing my job. Talking to him for an hour every morning is not standard protocol. No, she agreed. But neither is the change in his vitals since I started. She took a sip of coffee. I'm charting everything. Dr. Hale knows everything I'm doing. If you have concerns about patient care, you can take them to Sandra. Derek opened his mouth, closed it, picked up his lunch, and left. Amelia stood in the break room alone for a moment. She thought about what he'd said. The part about patient either dies or wakes up and goes home and never thinks about you again. She thought, that's fine. She thought, that's how it's supposed to work. She drank her coffee and went back to work. Down. The night the phone call came, Amelia had been asleep for maybe 90 minutes. It was 2:14 a.m. on a Tuesday in late April, and her phone was on the nightstand because she always kept it on the nightstand, and the number was St. Mary's, and her body was already sitting up before she'd finished reading the screen. Torres. She was already swinging her legs off the bed. It was Sandra on the other end. Not panicked. Sandra never panicked, but with a tightness in her voice that Amelia recognized immediately. We need you to come in. Mercer? A pause. Come in. She was dressed and out the door in 4 minutes. She lived 16 blocks from the hospital, and she ran 12 of them because she couldn't get a cab at 2 a.m., and the bus wasn't coming for 11 minutes, and she didn't want to wait. She was breathing hard when she pushed through the third-floor doors and started down the hall toward room 14, and Sandra met her halfway. What happened? Amelia demanded. His numbers changed about an hour ago. We don't know. Sandra stopped, then seemed to make a decision. Just go in. Amelia pushed the door open. The room was dim, just the monitoring equipment and the faint light from the hallway behind her. The machines were beeping at their usual pace. The piano playlist was off because the night shift didn't know about it. She walked to the bed. Ethan Mercer was exactly as she'd left him 12 hours ago. Still, pale, breathing with the steady artificial rhythm of a man whose body had found a kind of grim equilibrium. Except, she stepped closer. His left hand, which had been resting flat against the blanket in exactly the same position for months, was turned slightly, palm facing up. The fingers were moving, not spasming, not the random neural misfires that happen sometimes in unconscious patients and meant nothing. These were slow, deliberate, searching movements, like a man reaching for something he couldn't quite find in the dark. Amelia sat down in the chair and placed her hand under his. The fingers stopped moving. They closed, slowly, weakly, but unmistakably, around hers. She sat very still. Her throat had done something complicated that she didn't have a word for. Outside the window, the city was dark and cold and going about whatever the city went about at 2:14 a.m. "Hey," she said quietly, "I'm here." The monitors beeped. His grip didn't loosen. She stayed there until 5 a.m., until the morning shift started arriving and the hallway outside began to fill with the sounds of a hospital waking up. She stayed because leaving felt wrong in a way she couldn't fully articulate and didn't try to. She didn't tell Derek about the hand. She told Dr. Hale everything. She was carrying coffee and her broken umbrella, the one whose third spoke had snapped during a wind gust the previous October, and which she kept meaning to replace, when she walked into room 14 on a Thursday morning in early May. She was complaining about the elevator. She'd started 3 sentences about the ongoing failure of the third-floor elevator, and was gesturing with the coffee cup in a way that was slightly more animated than strictly necessary. And she was about to pivot to a story about Marco calling at 7 in the morning with a question about taxes. She stopped. The room was exactly as she'd left it, except for the eyes. Ethan Mercer's eyes were open, not glazed, not wandering in that unfocused way she'd been trained to recognize, the way eyes sometimes opened without the person behind them being anywhere near present. These eyes were open, and they were moving, and they stopped moving when they found her face. They were brown. She hadn't known that. The photographs never quite captured the color. Dark brown, with a quality of attention in them that was, after 7 months of absence, almost overwhelming. She didn't move for a full 3 seconds. "Mr. Mercer," she said, and her voice came out steady, which surprised her. "Can you hear me?" His throat worked. The effort was enormous. She could see it. Every muscle in his neck and jaw engaged in something that should have been effortless and was currently the hardest thing in his world. His lips moved. 2 words, barely a whisper, rough and dry and almost inaudible, like something that had been stored in a place it wasn't meant to be stored for too long. "I heard." Amelia stared at him. Her coffee was getting cold. Her broken umbrella was still in her hand. The monitors beeped, and she thought absurdly and briefly of Derek saying that's how it's supposed to work. And she thought of a photograph of a man and his daughter grinning at something outside the frame, and she thought of a night in late April when a hand had closed around hers in the dark. "Okay," she said. Her voice cracked slightly on the single word, and she didn't bother pretending it hadn't. "Okay, I'm going to get Dr. Hale." She was already moving toward the door. "Don't go anywhere," she said. It was a ridiculous thing to say to a man who had been immobile for 7 months. She knew that. She said it anyway. Behind her, almost too quiet to hear over the machines, she thought. She wasn't certain. She would never be entirely certain. She thought she heard a sound that might have been a laugh. She went to get Dr. Hale. She was running. Dr. Hale arrived in room 14 at 7:23 a.m., with 2 residents behind him and the particular focused energy of a man who had been waiting for this moment while simultaneously preparing himself for the possibility that it would never come. He found Amelia standing beside the bed with her hand resting near Ethan's arm, not touching, just near, the way you stood close to something fragile without wanting to crowd it. Ethan's eyes were still open, still tracking. When Dr. Hale walked through the door, those eyes moved to find him, assessed him with a slowness that was partly neurological and partly something else. something that looked almost deliberate. "Mr. Mercer," Dr. Hale said, pulling a penlight from his coat. "I'm Dr. Benjamin Hale. I've been your neurologist for the past 7 months. Can you follow this light for me?" The eyes followed. Dr. Hale exhaled through his nose. One of the residents, a young woman named Dr. Park, who had been rotating on the floor for 3 weeks, actually made a small sound that she immediately suppressed. "Can you squeeze my hand?" Dr. Hale placed 2 fingers against Ethan's palm. The squeeze was weak, barely perceptible, but it was there. "Good," Dr. Hale said. His voice was professionally steady and gave nothing away. "Very good." Amelia watched from the side of the room. She had stepped back when the doctors came in, made herself small and peripheral the way nurses learn to do in the presence of attending physicians who needed space to work. But she didn't leave. She told herself it was because she might be needed. She didn't examine that reasoning too closely. Over the next 40 minutes, Dr. Hale and his team ran through a systematic assessment that Amelia recognized from her training but had rarely seen performed with this level of intensity. Motor responses, pupil reactivity, basic cognitive indicators, like simple yes, no, questions delivered slowly, clearly, with enough pause between them to allow for the lag that was to be expected after this much time. Ethan couldn't speak beyond those 2 words yet. His throat was raw, his vocal cords weakened from months of disuse, his brain working through the enormous task of reconnecting pathways that had been dormant since November. But he could track movement. He could respond to simple commands. He could, when Dr. Hale asked him to blink twice if he understood what was being said to him, blink twice. He understood everything. That was the part that hit Amelia somewhere she wasn't prepared for. He had understood everything for some period of time. She didn't know how long, none of them knew how long. And he had been lying there, unable to signal it, unable to move, unable to do anything except exist in that terrible silent interior space while the world around him proceeded as though he were already gone. She thought about the conversation she'd had in that room, the complaints about the elevator, the deep-sea fish documentary, the things she'd said about his daughter, the night she'd sat there until 5 a.m. with his hand around hers. She felt her face get warm and was very glad that Dr. Hale wasn't looking at her. "We're going to run a full imaging series today," Dr. Hale was telling one of the residents. "And I want speech therapy in here by this afternoon. Not tomorrow, today." He turned to the other resident. "Get me a current metabolic panel and update the care plan. Everything changes as of this morning." Both residents moved simultaneously toward the door. Dr. Hale turned to Amelia. "Nurse Torres." He looked at her for a moment in a way that was difficult to read. "Whatever you've been doing in this room for the past 3 months, keep doing it." She nodded. He picked up the chart and followed his residents into the hallway. Amelia stood alone with Ethan again. He was watching her. "You heard everything," she said. It wasn't really a question. He blinked twice. She sat down in the chair. Her broken umbrella was still propped against the wall where she'd left it. Her coffee had gone completely cold. Outside the window, the concrete wall of the adjacent building was the same gray it had always been, indifferent to the fact that something enormous had just happened in this room. "Okay," she said. Her voice was careful. "For the record, I stand by all of it, including the thing I said about vegetables." Something happened at the corner of his mouth. It wasn't a smile exactly. His face didn't have the muscle control for a full expression yet. But there was a movement there, a faint, deliberate twitch that was not neurological noise. It was a response. Amelia looked at that almost smile for a moment, and then looked down at her cold coffee and thought, Derek was wrong about everything. The news broke by noon. Amelia wasn't sure who leaked it. Probably someone in administration, probably someone who hadn't thought through the implications, probably someone who was going to have a very uncomfortable conversation with hospital legal in the coming days. But by 12:30, there were 2 news vans in the parking lot and a reporter from a local affiliate standing on the sidewalk doing a piece to camera about the miraculous recovery of Chicago billionaire Ethan Mercer. The word miraculous irritated Dr. Hale deeply. She could tell because he used the phrase neurological progress 4 times in the span of 10 minutes when speaking with administration, emphasizing each word with the precision of a man building a wall out of accurate terminology to keep imprecise ones out. The word miraculous didn't particularly bother Amelia. She understood why people reached for it. When something happened that exceeded the framework you'd built to understand the world, you grabbed whatever word was closest. She didn't think it was miraculous. She thought it was the result of consistent, patient, specific care, combined with a man who had more reasons to fight than anyone outside that room had given him credit for. But she kept that thought to herself. What she did not keep to herself was her response to Sandra's suggestion, delivered apologetically but firmly at approximately 1 p.m., that Amelia might want to step back slightly from room 14, given the media situation, and the sudden intense interest from Ethan Mercer's corporate world in every aspect of his care. Step back, Amelia repeated. Just in terms of visibility, Sandra said. The family, Mr. Vincent Mercer, has requested a meeting with Dr. Hale about care coordination going forward, and there's going to be a lot of... I'm his primary nurse, Amelia said. Has that changed? Sandra hesitated. No, not officially. Then nothing has changed for me. Amelia picked up her afternoon medication cart. I have rounds. She pushed the cart down the hallway before Sandra could say anything else. She was not naive about what was happening. She'd been a nurse long enough to understand that the world outside room 14 operated on entirely different rules than the world inside it. Inside that room, Ethan Mercer was a patient, a man who was sick, who was getting better, who needed consistent care and familiar voices, and the small, unglamorous work of recovery. Outside that room, he was a billion-dollar question mark, and the answers to that question were going to make a lot of people either very comfortable or very nervous. She knew which category she fell into from their perspective. She also knew that Ethan had blinked twice when she asked if he'd heard everything, which meant he'd heard everything, including the things Vincent had said to Dr. Hale in the waiting room the night of the stroke, the things about timeline, the things about the other direction. She wondered if Ethan knew his cousin had asked that question. She wondered what 7 months of silence had given him time to think about. Vincent Mercer arrived at St. Mary's at 2:15 in the afternoon, and he brought 2 people with him, his attorney, a different one from the night of the stroke, younger, with the slightly aggressive posture of someone who billed by the hour and knew it, and a woman he introduced as Ethan's personal care coordinator, which was not a real medical title and which Dr. Hale acknowledged without validating. Amelia was in the hallway near the nurses' station when they came through. She recognized Vincent immediately from the months of brief, purposeful visits, the expensive watch, the tan, the way he moved through a hospital corridor like he was used to rooms rearranging themselves around him. He didn't recognize her. She was a nurse. She was holding a chart. She was standing near a wall. He looked through her the way people looked through furniture. "Where's the attending?" he asked the nurses' station generally. One of the newer nurses started to point. Amelia said quietly, "Dr. Hale is with a patient. He'll be available at 3. Vincent looked at her then. Actually, looked. "And you are?" "Amelia Torres. I'm Mr. Mercer's primary nurse." Something moved behind his eyes, a small recalibration. "Ah," he said, with the warmth of a man deciding whether something was useful to him. "You're the one who—" "Yes, I've heard about you." He smiled, and it had the same quality as the smile Dr. Hale had described from the night of the stroke. Teeth present, warmth absent. "Incredible work, really. We're all very grateful." "Thank you," Amelia said. "I'd love to speak with you at some point about his ongoing care. His care team going forward will obviously need to be restructured, given the change in his condition, and I want to make sure—" "Mr. Mercer's care is coordinated through Dr. Hale," Amelia said pleasantly. "Any changes to his care plan would go through him." The attorney made a small note on his phone. Vincent kept smiling. "Of course," he said. "Of course." He moved past her toward the waiting area. His care coordinator followed. The attorney paused beside Amelia for a moment, and she had the distinct sensation of being quietly evaluated, the way a chess player assessed pieces they hadn't decided what to do with yet. Then he followed Vincent. Amelia turned back to her chart. Her hands were completely steady. She was proud of that. Ethan's recovery moved in increments that were not the dramatic linear progression that the news coverage seemed to expect. There was a day in the second week when the speech therapist, a patient woman named Dr. Reyes, who had been doing this for 20 years and had the specific stillness of someone who understood the value of not rushing. When Ethan managed 3 consecutive sentences, they were slow and effortful, and one of them derailed partway through and had to be abandoned, but they were sentences. Doctor. Reyes marked something in her notes with the careful restraint of a professional and told him he was doing well, and Ethan looked at her with an expression that suggested he was reserving judgment on that assessment. There were days when the fatigue hit him so hard that he slept for 16 hours straight and woke disoriented and irritable in ways he couldn't fully express yet because expressing things still required more energy than he had. There were days when the physical therapy sessions, basic, early-stage work, relearning the simple mechanics of sitting upright, of controlled breathing, of the 1,000 small movements a body takes for granted, left him so wrecked that he could barely track a conversation afterward. There were days when the headaches came back, not as severe as whatever had happened in that conference room in November, but bad enough, pressing at the edges of his rebuilt awareness like something testing the walls from outside. Amelia was there for most of it, not in a hovering way. She had other patients. She had a full floor to manage, and a nursing load that didn't shrink because one patient's condition had become internationally newsworthy. But she was there in the morning, every morning, same time, same terrible coffee. She was there in the way that mattered, which was not the way of someone waiting for something remarkable to happen, but the way of someone who understood that unremarkable consistency was the actual work. She noticed things. She always noticed things. She noticed that Ethan's progress accelerated measurably on days when Vincent had visited the previous afternoon and deteriorated slightly in subtle but trackable ways. On days when the attorney had been present and the conversation had been about corporate matters and legal structures, and the question of whether Ethan's current cognitive state met the threshold for various things the attorney phrased in careful, distancing language that didn't quite manage to disguise what he was actually asking. She mentioned this to Dr. Hale during a care team check-in. "I've noticed it too," Dr. Hale said, without looking up from his notes. "I've also noticed that his vitals are measurably better on days when the visits are limited to medical staff." "What are you going to do about it?" He looked up. "I'm going to document everything and make sure our visitor protocol is clinically justified." "Which it is." He capped his pen. "What are you going to do about it?" "Keep showing up," she said. He nodded. "Good." The first time Ethan said her name, it was an accident. It was a Thursday morning, about 2.5 weeks after he'd woken up, and he'd been trying to ask about Sophie. His daughter's name was one of the words that came most easily, one of the first things his recovering speech had reached for and found. And he said it with a particular quality that was different from how he said other words, something in the sound of it that was simultaneously the most natural and the most painful thing Amelia heard him say. The question he was working toward was about Sophie's schedule. Who was picking her up? Whether the school knew, whether someone had talked to her about what was happening. And it was getting tangled because the connections between what he wanted to say and what his mouth was currently capable of producing were still unreliable, and he was frustrated, which he showed not by raising his voice, but by going very still in a way that Amelia had started recognizing as his version of losing patience. "Okay," she said. "Slow down. You're trying to ask about Sophie's school?" He exhaled, nodded. "She's been going. Same schedule. Mrs. Hargrove, your nanny, has been taking her." Amelia had learned this from the care coordination file. She'd made it her business to know. "The school counselor has been briefed. She's doing okay, Ethan." She said his name without thinking. It came out, the way things came out when you'd been talking to someone for months and the formal distance had eroded without you noticing. He went very still. Not the frustrated still. Something different. She realized what she'd done and felt a pulse of genuine awkwardness. "Sorry, Mr. Mercer." "Don't." His voice was rough and slow, each word still costing him something, but the word itself was quick, certain. He looked at her for a moment. "Ethan." She nodded. "Ethan." The name sat there between them, small and oddly significant, the way small things sometimes were. He went back to asking about Sophie. She answered what she could. Sophie came on a Saturday. Amelia wasn't working that day. She found out about it from Dr. Reyes on Monday morning, who mentioned it in passing, and she felt something she didn't examine too closely. something adjacent to relief and adjacent to something else she was going to leave unnamed. What she heard, secondhand from Dr. Reyes, who had been present, was this. Sophie Mercer was 7 years old and had her father's dark eyes and her late mother's apparently legendary stubbornness. And she had walked into room 14 carrying a drawing she had made of what appeared to be a man and a smaller person standing in front of a building with a lot of windows. And she had stopped about 3 feet from the bed and looked at her father with the particular measuring expression of a child who has been preparing themselves for something and is now determining whether their preparation was adequate. Then she had climbed onto the bed without asking anyone's permission, tucked herself against his side with the practiced ease of someone who had done this 10,000 times, and said, "You took forever." Ethan had, according to Dr. Reyes, not been able to respond verbally for about 40 seconds. Then he'd said, "I know. I'm sorry, Bug." Sophie had apparently accepted this, then asked if the hospital had good pudding or bad pudding, and someone had gone to find out. When Amelia heard this story, she was in the break room. She stood there with her coffee for a moment. Then she sat down. Then she thought about how long 7 months was, how long it was for a man to be unreachable, how long it was for a 7-year-old to wait. She thought, he had a reason. She thought, he always had a reason. She finished her coffee and went back to work. Month. The first real conversation happened on a Tuesday evening, about 3 weeks after he woke up, when the floor was quieter than usual and Amelia had stayed slightly past the end of her shift for reasons she told herself were clinical. She was updating his chart near the door when he said, "You ran." She looked up. "What?" "When you went to get Dr. Hale." His speech was better now, still slow, still requiring effort, but connected. Sentences rather than fragments. "I heard you running down the hall." She looked at him. "You could hear that?" Sound was, it came and went, like bad reception. He shifted against the pillow, the movement still careful, still deliberate. "But that morning I could hear everything. I heard you talking about the elevator. I heard you stop." "I stopped because your eyes were open." "I know." A pause. He seemed to be deciding something. "I'd been trying for about a week to open them. It kept not working." Amelia set the chart down. "A week," she said. "The signals weren't connecting right. I knew what I wanted my body to do. I just couldn't make it do it." He was quiet for a moment. "You know what that's like?" She thought about her mother refusing her medications. She thought about Marco at 2 a.m. calling about something she couldn't fix from across the city. She thought about money that wasn't there when it needed to be. "I have some version of it, yeah." He looked at her for a moment with something that wasn't sympathy exactly. He didn't have enough information about her life for sympathy. It was more like recognition, like he'd heard something in her answer that resonated with something he already knew. "Why did you keep talking to me?" he asked. She thought about how to answer that honestly. "Because you were still there." "You didn't know that." "I suspected it," she said, "and I thought, even if I was wrong, what was the cost? I talk to myself all the time anyway. It's basically the same thing." His almost smile appeared again. It was getting more defined now, the muscle control coming back incrementally the way everything was coming back, piece by piece, and not without effort. "That's not a very medical reason." "No," she agreed. But the medical reasons were all pointing the same direction anyway. He was quiet for a moment, then, "How long were you my nurse before I woke up?" "About 3 months." "And before that?" 7 months of other nurses. He took that in. She watched him think about it. The 7 months before her, the silence, the machines, the room that nobody wanted to be assigned to. She could see it move through him, whatever it was, a kind of reckoning he was doing privately. "I heard some of them," he said. "The ones before you." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. Amelia nodded. She understood what he wasn't saying. "I heard the lawyers too," he said then. His voice was the same careful, effortful pace, but something had shifted underneath it, a quality that had nothing to do with neurological recovery. She met his eyes. "Which ones?" she asked, though she suspected she knew. "Mine. Vincent's." A beat. "Both." She waited. "Vincent asked Dr. Hale how long," Ethan said. "Which direction?" She did not say "I know." She did not say "I'm sorry."
She let it sit there because it deserved to sit there, because it was true and it was ugly, and covering it up with the soft language of reassurance would have been the wrong thing to do. "How long have you known?" she asked. "Since March, I think." "I heard him on the phone in the room. He thought I couldn't hear." Ethan looked at the ceiling for a moment, then back at her. "I had a lot of time to think about it." "I imagine you did. 7 months is a long time to think." "What did you think about?" He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, "Sophie, mostly. Whether she was scared, whether anyone was—" He stopped, pressed his lips together. "Whether anyone was just talking to her, not about logistics, not about what was going to happen to the money or the company or the—" He stopped again. "Just talking to her. Amelia thought about a little girl who climbed into a hospital bed and said you took forever and then asked about pudding." "She seems okay," Amelia said, "from what I've heard." "She's tough," he said. "She got it from Claire." The name came out differently than any other word. Not heavier exactly, but slower, like he was carrying it carefully. "My wife." "I know," Amelia said. "I read about her." "What did you read?" She thought about it. "That she was funny. There was an interview you gave a while back. You said she was the funniest person you'd ever met, and you said it like it surprised you every time you thought about it." Something happened in his face. Not the almost smile. Something quieter and more complicated. "Yeah," he said. "She was." Silence settled between them, but not the uncomfortable kind. The kind that had space in it, that didn't need filling immediately. "I read everything I could find about you," Amelia admitted, "before I started here, after I got the assignment." She shrugged. "I wanted to know who I was talking to." "What did you conclude?" "That you were someone who built something real from nothing, which I respect. That you probably worked too much, which is the most predictable thing about successful people. That you loved your daughter in a way that was obvious even through business profiles, which are not designed to show that kind of thing." He was watching hers with that quality of attention that still, after weeks, caught her slightly off guard. It was the attention of someone who had spent 7 months listening without being able to respond. Someone who had learned to hear things very precisely. "You could have just read the file," he said. "The file doesn't tell me who someone is. It tells me what's wrong with their body." "And the articles told you who I was?" "The articles told me what you'd done," she said. "Who you are is what I figured out in here." He looked at her for a moment. "And?" She picked up her chart. "Still working on it," she said. She caught the almost smile again on her way to the door. Fuller this time than it had been before. Vincent came 3 days later with the attorney and a new face, a man named Garrett, who was apparently Mercer Capital's acting COO, and who had the practiced ease of someone who was comfortable with boardrooms and somewhat less comfortable with hospitals. They sat in a small conference room on the 3rd floor that Dr. Hale had made available for family meetings, and Ethan sat in a wheelchair, his first time out of the bed for anything other than physical therapy. And Amelia stood near the wall because she'd been asked by Dr. Hale to be present for medical continuity, which was technically accurate and also, she suspected, strategic. Ethan didn't look like the man in the annual report photographs yet. He was still thin. His left hand had a tremor that came and went. He moved carefully. But his eyes, when Vincent walked into the room and said, "Ethan, my God, it's so good to see you looking better," were entirely clear. "Vincent," Ethan said. His voice was still slower than it would become, but the tone was unambiguous. Vincent sat down. Garrett sat beside him. The attorney opened a portfolio. "We have a lot to catch up on," Vincent said warmly. "The company there have been some necessary changes in your absence, just to keep things running, and I want to walk you through—" "Who authorized the restructuring of the capital reserves in December?" Ethan asked. Silence. Vincent blinked. "We had to make some operational decisions, the board. The board doesn't have the authority to restructure the capital reserves without my sign-off. That's in the founding documents." Ethan's voice was slow, and the effort showed, but every word landed where he'd placed it. "You know that. You've known it since you joined the board in 2019. The attorney made a note. "Ethan," Vincent said, and his voice had shifted into a gentler register, the one reserved for managing difficult situations. "You've been through something enormous.
I completely understand if you want to eat. I want to see the full financial statements from November through now, Ethan said. I want them on paper, not in a presentation. I want them by Friday. He looked at Garrett. All of them. Garrett looked at Vincent. Vincent held his smile in place with what appeared to be considerable effort. Of course, Vincent said. We want to be completely transparent. Good, Ethan said. The meeting lasted 40 more minutes. Amelia stood near the wall and watched Ethan Mercer, who had been silent and unreachable for 7 months, dismantle every careful thing that had been constructed in his absence with the quiet, methodical efficiency of someone who had spent a very long time thinking and was only now beginning to act. He was not the man in the annual report photographs. He was sharper than that. And something else, something that hadn't been visible in any photograph she'd seen, something that had perhaps been covered over by years of performance and strategy and the particular armor that successful, lonely people wore without knowing they were wearing it. She couldn't name it exactly. She thought about it on the bus ride home. The red line was delayed at Belmont, as it always was, and she stood in the car holding the overhead bar and watching the dark tunnel outside the window. She thought, 7 months of silence changed a man. She thought, not all changes are damage. She thought about the way he'd said, "Who you are is what I figured out in here," back to her, almost verbatim, and the look that had come with it. She thought about the almost smile, which was becoming less of an almost every day. The train lurched forward. The tunnel gave way to gray evening sky above the elevated tracks. Somewhere across the city, a 7-year-old was probably arguing about pudding or vegetables or the irrelevance of bedtime. Amelia held the bar and let the train carry her home, and did not think about what she was feeling, because some things moved better when you didn't look directly at them. On a Friday morning in late May, Ethan walked the length of the third-floor hallway. Not alone, the physical therapist, a man named Torres who shared Amelia's last name and found this funnier than she did, walked beside him, and there was a rolling IV stand that he was mostly ignoring, but on his own 2 feet, without the wheelchair, without support beyond a hand hovering near his elbow that didn't actually make contact. It was 38 steps. He counted them. Amelia knew this because she was at the nurse's station when he reached the end of the hall and turned around, breathing hard and slightly pale but upright, and he looked at her and said, 38. I heard, she said. That's nothing, he said. The physical therapist was already reaching for the wheelchair that Ethan was already ignoring. It's 38 more than you could do a month ago, Amelia said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he turned and started walking back. 38 steps, return trip. The physical therapist made a note. The wheelchair went unused. Amelia watched him walk and did not think about what she was feeling, the same way she'd been not thinking about it for weeks, and she was getting less successful at it every day. The financial statements arrived on Thursday, not Friday. Amelia didn't know this until she walked into room 14 on Friday morning and found Ethan sitting up in bed with a stack of papers on the adjustable tray table, a pen in his right hand that he was gripping more tightly than necessary, and an expression on his face that she recognized from the conference room meeting. That particular quality of focused, cold attention that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with the kind of clarity that came from having no more patience for pretense. You're up early, she said. I didn't sleep. He didn't look up from the page he was reading. She checked his vitals, made her notes, and didn't ask. She'd learned early that Ethan Mercer was not a man who responded well to being prompted toward things he wasn't ready to say. He talked when he was ready. Pushing made him go quieter. She was adjusting his IV line when he said, They moved $40 million. She stopped. Out of the company? Into a holding structure that Vincent controls. He set down the pen. It was done in January. The documentation it's designed to look like a routine capital allocation. But it's not. He looked at the papers with the expression of someone examining something that has confirmed a suspicion they'd hoped wouldn't be confirmed. I built this company. I know every line of how it's supposed to look. Amelia finished with the IV. She sat down. What are you going to do? I've already called my attorney. The real one, not the one Vincent's been using. He picked up the pen again. I should have had legal representation in place from the beginning, independent of the board. He said it flatly, without self-pity, the way he said things about his own mistakes. I didn't think I'd be in a coma for 7 months. Most people don't plan for that. People don't plan. Most people don't have $40 million that someone can quietly move while they're unconscious. He looked at her. I'm not looking for sympathy. I know, she said. I'm not offering any. Something in his face eased slightly. She had come to understand one of the things he valued in their conversations. The absence of the cushioning that everyone else felt compelled to provide him. The doctors and the physical therapists, and even Dr. Reyes, who was genuinely excellent at her job, all spoke to him with the particular gentleness reserved for recovering patients, which was appropriate and professional, and which Ethan found, she suspected, quietly maddening. Amelia just talked to him. The attorney thinks we can recover most of it, he said. It'll be ugly. There will be a board fight. He paused. Vincent has been telling the board for 6 months that I'm unlikely to return to full cognitive function. The room was quiet for a moment. He said that to the board, Amelia said, in writing. A beat. I have the emails. She looked at him. And how does it feel reading that? He was quiet for long enough that she thought he was going to redirect the conversation the way he sometimes did when she pushed into territory he wasn't ready for. Then he said, like finding out something you already knew and had been hoping was wrong. She nodded slowly. The worst part isn't the money, he said. The worst part is that I hired him. Years ago, when the company was new and I needed board members I could trust, I brought Vincent on because he was family, and I thought that meant something. He set the papers down. His left hand had the faint tremor she'd noticed before. It came when he was tired or stressed, and she clocked it automatically, the way she clocked all the small physical indicators that told her how he was actually doing beneath whatever he was presenting. It's a particular kind of stupid trusting people because of what they are instead of who they are. You were building something from scratch, and you needed people, Amelia said. That's not stupid. That's just what was available. It was naive. Maybe. But you were in your mid-20s and you just lost your wife, and you were running a company and raising a daughter alone. Being slightly naive about which family members were worth trusting seems like a very human thing to be. He looked at her in the way he sometimes did, like he was deciding how much of what she'd said to let in. You're defending me. I'm providing context, she said. There's a difference. Is there? Yes. Defending you would be telling you it wasn't your fault. Context is just the whole picture instead of one corner of it. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he picked up the pen and went back to the papers. The tremor is worse when you're holding the pen like that, she said. Loosen your grip. He looked down at his hand. He loosened his grip. The tremor settled slightly. Thank you, he said, without looking up. That's what I'm here for, she said, and meant it in both senses. The legal process that Ethan set in motion moved with the kind of speed that considerable resources and genuine grievance could generate. By the second week of June, there were 2 separate legal actions underway: an independent audit of Mercer Capital's finances from the previous 8 months, and a board emergency meeting scheduled for the following Thursday, at which Ethan planned to attend via video call from his hospital room. Dr. Hale had opinions about this. You are 6 weeks out of a coma, he told Ethan during a Tuesday morning consultation. Your neurological recovery is progressing well. Your physical recovery is progressing. Your stress indicators are, he paused, choosing his words, concerning. My stress indicators are responding to a concerning situation, Ethan said. That's fair. And I'm not telling you to ignore the situation. I'm telling you that your brain is still healing. Stress at this level, sustained over weeks, is not... I know, Ethan said. What would you have me do? Wait? I'd have you delegate. To whom? Ethan's voice was even, not hostile, genuinely asking. My COO has been feeding Vincent information for 6 months. My CFO signed off on the capital transfer. My general counsel is the one who structured the holding company. He looked at Dr. Hale. Who would you like me to delegate to? Dr. Hale had the expression of a man who had walked into a reasonable point and wasn't going to pretend otherwise. Make sure you're sleeping. I'm sleeping. More than 4 hours. A pause. I'm working on it. Nurse Torres. Dr. Hale turned to her. He did this sometimes, turned to her as though she were a second opinion, or perhaps a more reliable source of information about his patient's actual behavior.
Is he sleeping? Amelia looked at Ethan. Ethan looked at her with an expression that was almost pleading in its restraint. He was awake at 6 this morning when I came in, she said. I don't know what time he started. She doesn't know because she wasn't here, Ethan said. You could have been awake since 3, Amelia said. I could have been awake since 5. The difference between 3 and 5 is not the when you think it is. Dr. Hale made a note. Sleep, he said. That's not optional. And I want the video call kept to 2 hours maximum. Ethan nodded. Dr. Hale left. Amelia stayed. 4 hours, she said. I was thinking. About what? He looked at the window. The concrete wall of the adjacent building had not changed since November, but June light was different from winter light, hitting it at a different angle and finding, improbably, a small patch near the top where something green had taken hold in a crack in the masonry. She'd noticed it a few weeks ago. She'd been meaning to point it out. About whether any of it matters, he said. The company, the money. Whether getting it back changes anything that actually needs changing. She waited. Vincent can have $40 million, he said, slowly, like he was working it out while saying it. I have a lot more than $40 million, and I spent 7 months as an unconscious body in a room while my daughter went to school without me and came home to a nanny and nobody, not one person in my orbit who was paid to care about the company. Nobody called that school to ask if Sophie was okay. He paused. You did. Amelia was quiet for a moment. I called the school counselor in March, she said, just to check. I know. The counselor mentioned it to Mrs. Hargrove. Mrs. Hargrove told me. He looked at her. You weren't her nurse. You weren't paid to do that. You had no reason to do that. She's 7, Amelia said. Her father was in a coma. That's a reason. For you it was. He turned back to the window. For the people I paid very well to care about the things I cared about? Apparently it wasn't. He was quiet for a moment. That's the thing 7 months teaches you. Who actually shows up? Amelia looked at the small patch of green in the crack in the concrete wall and thought, I should tell him about that plant. She didn't yet. She tucked it away for later, for a morning when he needed something small and true to look at. Get the $40 million back, she said. Not because it matters more than Sophie. Get it back because letting Vincent take it would be letting him take something you built, and you built it for her. She stood up. But sleep more than 4 hours. Both things can be true. He looked at her for a moment with that expression she'd stopped trying to categorize. You're very good at that, he said. At what? Making complicated things simple without making them smaller. She picked up her chart. That's the whole job, she said. She meant nursing. She wasn't sure that was entirely what he heard. Sophie came back on a Saturday again, which was becoming a pattern, and this time Amelia was working. She was at the nurse's station at the end of the hall when the elevator opened. The elevator that had, in an event Amelia had reported to Ethan with considerable satisfaction, finally been repaired in the 3rd week of May, and a little girl walked out ahead of a tall woman who must have been Mrs. Hargrove. Sophie Mercer was small for 7. Dark hair pulled into 2 uneven pigtails that suggested she'd had opinions about how they should look, and those opinions had not entirely aligned with Mrs. Hargrove's execution. She was wearing a green jacket over a shirt that had what appeared to be a cartoon dinosaur on it, and she was carrying a backpack that was too large for her, and a paper bag that she held carefully with both hands. She walked down the hall with the particular purposefulness of a child who knows exactly where she is going and is not interested in detours. She stopped at the nurse's station and looked at Amelia. Are you the nurse? She asked. Not rudely, just directly, in the way that children were direct before they learned to soften things. I'm one of the nurses, Amelia said. I'm Amelia. My dad talks about you. Sophie set the paper bag on the counter. He said you talked to him when he was sleeping. Amelia looked at the paper bag, then at Sophie. That's right. I talk to my fish when I'm doing homework, Sophie said, apparently establishing the logical framework of this situation. They can't understand me, but I think they like the sound. That's probably exactly right, Amelia said. Sophie nodded, satisfied. I brought him cookies. Mrs. Hargrove said he probably can't eat cookies yet because of the... She paused, clearly reconstructing a word she'd memorized. Swallowing therapy. But I made them anyway because I thought maybe he could look at them. She considered this. Is that stupid? No, Amelia said immediately. That's actually very smart. Looking at something good while you're working toward being able to have it is good motivation. Sophie appeared to find this professionally satisfying. That's what I thought. She picked up her bag. Can I go in? He's expecting you, Amelia said. Sophie walked down the hall. Mrs. Hargrove, who had been standing a diplomatic distance back during this exchange, caught Amelia's eye and gave a small, tired, genuine smile that communicated approximately 17 things without saying any of them. Amelia watched Sophie push open the door to room 14 and go in. She heard faintly from down the hall, I brought cookies. And Ethan's voice, rough and slow, but warm, in a way that was entirely different from how he spoke about anything else. I can see that, Bug. Come here. Amelia went back to her chart. She was smiling and she didn't try to stop. The board meeting happened on a Thursday and lasted 4 hours and 40 minutes, which was 2 hours and 40 minutes longer than Dr. Hale had authorized, and which Amelia found out about when she arrived for the evening check to find Ethan gray with exhaustion and his left hand tremoring in a way that was well past the threshold she'd been monitoring. 4 hours and 40 minutes, she said. It ran long. You think? It's done. He leaned his head back against the pillow. His eyes were closed. Vincent resigned. Garrett resigned. 3 board members who sided with them are gone. A pause. The audit findings were thorough. Is that a good thorough or a bad thorough? Good for me. Bad for them. He opened his eyes. 42 million, not 40. There were secondary transactions I hadn't found yet. Amelia checked his blood pressure. It was higher than she wanted. Ethan, I know. I'm serious. This level of stress, sustained. I know, he said again. It's done now. The legal process will run its course without me in the middle of it. I told my attorney to handle everything from here. He turned his head and looked at her. I need something else to focus on. Like physical therapy. Like what I'm going to do differently. He said it quietly, not dramatically, not with the weight of pronouncement, just a statement of fact. I've been thinking about it for months. What I was doing before was, I was building. That was the whole thing. Build the company, grow the assets, secure Sophie's future. And somewhere in there I forgot that securing her future meant more than making sure the money was there. Amelia finished charting his vitals without responding immediately. She was thinking about how to say the next thing accurately. You hadn't forgotten, she said. You were just doing it wrong. There's a difference. He looked at her. People who've forgotten don't lie in comas thinking about their 7-year-old school counselor, she said. You just got the weights wrong. Put the work on one side of the scale and told yourself it balanced. It didn't balance. No, but recognizing that isn't nothing. He was quiet for a moment. The tremor in his left hand was settling now that he'd stopped pushing. She watched it happen, the way she watched all his physical indicators, with the particular attention of someone whose job was to track the distance between where a patient was and where they needed to be. Can I ask you something? He said. Sure. What do you do when you're not here? She looked at him. It was an odd question for their dynamic. She'd spent months talking about her life in the incidental, one-sided way of someone who didn't expect to be heard, and now that he could actually respond, the conversations had been mostly about him, which was appropriate given that he was the one in a hospital bed. I go home, she said. I check on my mother. I call Marco if he hasn't called me. I watch things on my laptop that I fall asleep in the middle of. Marco is your brother. Yeah. What's wrong with him? She raised her eyebrows slightly. Why do you think something's wrong with him? Because of the way you say his name, Ethan said. You say it like my mother used to say my name when I was doing something that worried her. Amelia was quiet for a moment. She wasn't used to being read. She was usually the one doing the reading. He's fine, she said. He's just going through something. He's young and the city's expensive and his job isn't good for him, but he doesn't want to hear that from me. Why not? Because I'm his older sister, and I've been the responsible one since we were kids, and he associates my opinions with obligations he doesn't want. That's not your fault. No, she agreed. But it's still true. He watched her for a moment. Do you have a lot of people who let you help them? The question landed in a place she hadn't expected. She thought about it honestly. I have patients, she said. And my mother. And Marco, when things get bad enough that he runs out of other options. She straightened up. I'm not complaining. I didn't think you were. I'm good at this. Taking care of things, people. It's what I'm built for. She said it without self-pity, which was the only way she could say it. It doesn't bother me that it goes one direction most of the time. Ethan looked at her in the long, precise way he had, the way she'd initially found unnerving and had gradually come to simply accept as part of how he processed the world. Do you believe that? He asked. Or is that just what you tell yourself so you don't have to think about it? The question sat there. Amelia looked at him. That's a very rude thing to say, she said. I know, I'm sorry. He didn't look entirely sorry. You're not entirely sorry? No, he agreed, but I'm partially sorry. She looked at him for another moment. Then she said, both. It's both. She picked up the chart. Sleep. Real sleep, not work sleep. She walked to the door. Amelia. She stopped. Thank you, he said, for the honest answer. She stood in the doorway for a moment with her back to him. You're very irritating, she said, for someone I spent 3 months talking to about the elevator. She heard the almost smile in his voice when he said, I know, I've been told. She went out into the hallway and stood there for a second with her chart against her chest, listening to the ordinary sounds of a hospital floor going about its business. And she thought about the question he'd asked and the answer she'd given, and the fact that both things being true simultaneously was not a comfortable place to be. She had known that already. She was less good at pretending she didn't than she used to be. The complication arrived on a Tuesday morning in mid-June without announcement in the form of a woman named Diana Cole. Amelia had heard the name before. Peripherally, in the context of the board restructuring, Diana Cole was one of Ethan's longest-tenured board members, one of the 3 who had sided with Vincent in the early months, and then quietly reversed position when the audit findings came out. She was 61 years old, had built her own financial services firm in the 90s, and was, according to the 3 separate people who mentioned her in Amelia's presence, formidable. She arrived at 9 a.m. without an attorney and without an appointment, and told the nurses' station she was there to see Ethan Mercer on board business. The nurses' station called Amelia. Amelia went out to the waiting area and found a woman in her early 60s, short silver hair, wearing a blazer the color of slate, sitting with the stillness of someone who was entirely comfortable making other people wait. Miss Cole, Amelia said, I'm Nurse Torres. Mr. Mercer doesn't have any meetings scheduled this morning. Diana Cole looked at her with the assessment of someone who was very good at reading rooms. You're the one who kept talking to him. I was his nurse. Still are, I understand. She crossed her legs. I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm here because the situation with Vincent was partly my responsibility, and I'd like to speak with Ethan directly. She paused. I sided with Vincent in January. I thought Ethan wasn't coming back. I was wrong, and I'd like to say so to his face. Amelia looked at her. I'll ask if he's willing to see you. Fair enough. She went back to room 14. Ethan was in the middle of his morning physical therapy session, walking the hall, which he was now doing 3 lengths before he stopped, and she waited until he'd finished and sat back down before she said, Diana Cole is in the waiting room. He went still. She says she's not here to cause trouble, Amelia said. She says she wants to talk to you directly about what happened in January. What January means is that she voted to let Vincent restructure the board's oversight powers, Ethan said, which is what made everything else possible. I know. I told her I'd ask. He was quiet. She watched him think through it, the careful internal calculation that she'd come to recognize as his processing mode, the one that happened behind his eyes while his face stayed neutral. Send her in, he said. Amelia went and got Diana Cole and left them alone. She was at the nurse's station 40 minutes later when Diana Cole walked out. The woman stopped beside the station and looked at Amelia for a moment. He's different from before, Diana said. He's been through something significant, Amelia said. No, I mean... Diana Cole seemed to be selecting her words with care. I've known Ethan Mercer for 9 years. He was always sharp, always strategic. But there was a... She paused. A wall. A very well-constructed, very consistent wall that he kept between himself and everything that wasn't business.
She looked down the hall toward room 14. It's gone. Amelia didn't say anything. I don't know what you did in that room for 3 months, Diana said. But whatever it was, it didn't just keep him alive. It changed something. She looked at Amelia directly. I thought you should know that. She picked up her bag and walked to the elevator.
Amelia stood at the nurse's station and thought about what Diana Cole had said. She thought about it from a clinical angle. She was good at the clinical angle. She could use it like a tool, examine things through it, and keep a useful distance. Then she put the clinical angle down and just thought about it. The wall. She'd seen it. In the early weeks, when Ethan had been learning to speak again and the conversations had been careful and bounded, she'd felt it. The places where he redirected, the questions he didn't ask, the particular way he could be entirely present and entirely closed at the same time. It was less there now. She didn't know what to do with that information, so she filed it beside the other things she wasn't sure what to do with and went to check on her other patients. The evening that Amelia told him about the plant was the last evening of June, and it happened the way the best things in their conversations happened. Without plan, without purpose, just the accumulation of ordinary time in a room that had gradually become something neither of them had a good word for. He was eating dinner, soft food still. The swallowing therapy was ongoing, which he found humiliating and which he was addressing by being extremely good at it out of sheer stubbornness. And she was finishing her charting near the window when she finally said, "There's a plant in the wall." He looked up. She pointed. Up near the top of the concrete wall of the adjacent building, just visible in the evening light, the small green thing that had appeared in the crack in the masonry sometime in spring. He looked at it. "I've been meaning to tell you for a month," she said. "Every morning I'd look at it and think I'd mention it, and then we'd start talking about something else." He was quiet for a moment. "What kind of plant?" "I don't know. Something stubborn." He looked at it for a long time. She watched him look at it. "I've been staring at that wall for 6 months without seeing that," he said. "You were busy. I was in a coma for half of that." "Comas are busy," she said. "You had a lot to think about." He almost smiled. Real smile now, not the almost. She'd stopped calling it an almost somewhere in the 4th week, when the muscles had recovered enough to make the full version, and he'd started using it without quite seeming to notice. "That's a generous way to describe a coma." "I contain multitudes," she said. He laughed. It was the first time she'd heard him laugh, and it was short and a little rusty from disuse, like something that hadn't been run in a while, and it was the best sound she'd heard in a long time. She looked at the plant in the crack in the wall and thought, something stubborn. She thought, yes. She thought, that tracks. She closed her chart and said goodnight and walked out into the hallway with the sound of it still in her ears, and she did not file this one away with the things she wasn't examining. She let herself carry it home on the red line, which was running on time for once, all the way across the dark city to her cramped apartment on the south side where her mother was waiting, and her brother had left 3 voicemails and the dishes from breakfast were still in the sink. She stood in her kitchen and washed the dishes and thought about a man who had learned to laugh again, and she let herself feel whatever she felt about that without putting a name on it. Some things were okay without a name. Ethan was discharged on a Friday in the 2nd week of July. The paperwork took most of the morning. There was a final neurological assessment from Dr. Hale, a last session with Dr. Reyes, who gave him a set of speech exercises to continue at home and watched him do them once with the careful eye of someone who knew the difference between a patient who would follow through and one who would not, and then decided without saying so that he would. There was a physical therapy exit briefing, a pharmacy run, a conversation about follow-up appointments that was more complicated than it needed to be because Ethan's schedule was apparently already filling up with things that Dr. Hale considered inadvisable. The discharge paperwork listed his condition as stable with continued outpatient monitoring. What it did not list was the 8 months of accumulated weight that a person carried out of a place like this, the particular heaviness of having been that close to gone for that long, of having heard your own legal representatives discuss your probable non-recovery while you lay 7 feet away and could not move your fingers. Amelia's shift started at 7. She had known for a week that this Friday was the day. She had been matter-of-fact about it in the way she was matter-of-fact about most things, and she had noticed, without letting herself examine it too directly, that she was sleeping slightly worse than usual. She walked into room 14 at 7:15 with her coffee, the same as always, and found Ethan already dressed, real clothes, The first time she'd seen him in anything other than a hospital gown or the loose therapeutic clothing of early rehabilitation. Dark pants, a gray sweater, the kind of deliberate, understated clothing of someone who had money but had stopped needing to prove it. He was sitting in the chair near the window, not the bed, his hands resting on his knees, watching the concrete wall of the adjacent building where the stubborn plant was still alive, still green, somehow having survived the entire summer in a crack in the masonry. He looked like himself and also like someone she hadn't met before. Both things at once. The sharpness that had always been there, but the wall that Diana Cole had named seemed the very well-constructed, very consistent wall was genuinely different now. Thinner, more like a screen than a barrier. "You're dressed," she said. "Mrs. Hargrove is bringing Sophie at 10, he said. "I wanted to look like I had it together." "You look like you have it together." "I don't entirely have it together."
"I know," she said, "but Sophie's 7, close enough." He almost smiled. Then the almost completed itself. "I've been sitting here since 6 thinking about that plant." She looked at it. "Still there?" "What about it?" "Wondering how it got there, whether it started from a seed that blew in, or whether something grew up through the crack from the ground." He paused. "Whether it knows it's in a wall. Plants don't know things. Maybe not. But they respond to conditions. They go toward light even when the light is coming from a strange direction." He looked at her. "That feels like a kind of knowing." She sat down in the other chair, the one she'd been sitting in for 5 months, worn slightly at the armrest in a way she'd probably imagined but felt real anyway. "Are we talking about the plant?" "Mostly," he said. She drank her coffee. Outside, the July morning was doing what July mornings in Chicago did, pressing heat against every surface, making the air thick, turning the sliver of sky visible above the concrete wall into a flat, bleached blue. "I want to ask you something," he said. She waited. "After today, when I'm not your patient anymore," he stopped, started again, which was rare for him. He usually assembled sentences before deploying them. "I'd like to keep talking to you." The room was quiet. "Keep talking," she said. "That's a limited way of putting it." He was looking at his hands. "I'm aware of what this looks like from the outside. Man in hospital, nurse takes care of him, man develops. Attachment. I know how that reads. I know it's the most predictable." "Ethan," he stopped. "I know how it reads too," she said. "I've thought about it." "And?" She turned her coffee cup in her hands. The vending machine coffee was bad enough that she'd long since stopped tasting it and just used it as something to do with her hands during difficult conversations. "And I don't know how to separate the parts," she said honestly. "The part where you were my patient and the part where you're whatever you are now. I don't know if those are actually separable or if I'm just telling myself they are because it's simpler." "What if they're not separable?" he said. "What if they're just the same thing?" "Then I'm a nurse who developed feelings for a patient, which is a professional problem and also just..." She stopped. "It's complicated." "I know it's complicated." "You're also..." She gestured vaguely at the room, at him, at the abstract idea of everything his life contained. "You're a lot, Ethan. You're a lot of life." "Is that a polite way of saying I'm too much?" "No. It's a direct way of saying you're a lot." She looked at him. "You have a company and a legal battle and a 7-year-old, and you're 8 months out of a coma, and every single decision you make for the next year is going to matter more than normal decisions matter. That's a lot to be near. You've been near it for 5 months. That was different. How?" She thought about how to say it accurately. "When you were my patient, I had a role, a clear thing to do. I knew what I was supposed to be and I was good at it." She set the coffee down. "I don't know what I'm supposed to be after today." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm not asking you to be anything," he said. "I'm asking if we can have dinner sometime." She looked at him. "That's it," he said. "Just dinner." "You're a terrible liar," she said, "for someone who spent 9 years in corporate finance." "I'm not lying. You're simplifying." "Yes," he said, "strategically." She looked at him for a long moment. He looked back. The monitors that had beeped the background rhythm of their entire acquaintance were gone. He'd been off the continuous monitoring for 3 weeks, and the room was quiet in a way it hadn't been for most of the time she'd spent in it. "Dinner," she said finally. Just dinner. One dinner, and then we figure out if there's a next thing. That's all I'm asking. She stood up. I have other patients. I know. She was at the door. She turned back. Wear comfortable shoes when Sophie comes. She's going to want to walk everywhere. He looked at her. How do you know that? Because she's 7 and she's been waiting for 8 months and she's going to want to do everything with you immediately. Amelia tilted her head. Also, she told me. He laughed. That warm, slightly rusty laugh that had become one of her favorite sounds in recent weeks without her making a conscious decision about it. You and my daughter have been comparing notes. She brings cookies every Saturday. We've had time to talk. She went out into the hallway before she could see whatever his face did after that. He left at 11:15. Sophie had arrived at 10 with Mrs. Hargrove and a drawing she had made of the hospital from the outside, which she presented to Amelia with the seriousness of someone transferring important documents. So you remember, Sophie said. Amelia thanked her with equal seriousness and taped it to the wall of the nurse's station, which made Sophie visibly pleased. Amelia watched them go from the end of the hallway, Ethan walking on his own, slowly but steadily, Sophie beside him with her hand tucked inside his elbow in the half-unconscious way of a child who didn't want to admit she was making sure he didn't fall, Mrs. Hargrove behind them with a bag. The elevator opened. Sophie said something. Ethan looked down at her and said something back. The doors closed. The hallway was ordinary again. Derek appeared beside her with the particular timing of someone who had been waiting for the moment to pass before saying anything. You okay? Of course, she said. You've been his nurse for 5 months. I know how long I've been his nurse. Derek was quiet for a beat. I was wrong, he said, about what I said in the break room. In March. She turned to look at him. This was unexpected enough that she took a moment to register it. Derek's version of apologizing was typically more oblique than this. You were right about the change in his vitals, he said, and about the approach, the talking. He picked up his chart and looked at it without actually reading it. I've been doing this 12 years and I told myself I'd seen everything worth seeing and I didn't. He stopped. I didn't give you enough credit. Thank you, Derek, she said, and meant it. He nodded and walked away because Derek's capacity for emotional directness had a hard ceiling, and he had just hit it. Amelia watched him go and thought that the day was full of unexpected things, and it wasn't even noon. Bam! She called Marco that evening. He picked up on the 3rd ring, which was better than usual. Hey! Hey! She was on the couch with her shoes off and a glass of water she'd poured and not touched. How's the warehouse? Same. A pause. Hot. Summer loading dock is brutal. I know. I'm sorry. It's fine. The defensive edge that lived in his voice whenever she expressed concern was there, but quieter than usual. How's work? My long-term patient was discharged today. The coma guy? He wasn't in a coma when he left. Right. Obviously. She could hear him moving around on his end, the sound of a television going quiet, the specific acoustic of his apartment which she knew well enough to picture. You okay? She thought about the question. It was the same question Derek had asked, and she'd answered automatically. Marco asking it felt different because he knew her in the way only people who had grown up alongside you could know you. Imprecisely, incompletely, but with an instinct that bypassed everything she'd constructed to manage the impressions she made. I don't know yet, she said. A pause. Was it just a job thing? I don't know that either. He was quiet for a moment. Mia. She hadn't been called that in a while. He used it rarely and selectively. What? You're allowed, he said. Whatever it is. You're allowed to have it. She looked at the ceiling. You sound like Mom. Mom would have said it louder and with more gesturing. That got a small laugh out of her. How would you know? You never call her. I called her Tuesday. You did? She told me about her blood sugar for 45 minutes. He sounded aggrieved about this in a way that was clearly not entirely genuine. I'm a good son. You're an adequate son. Adequate's all anyone can hope for. Another pause, softer. Are you good? I'm okay, she said. I think I'll be good. Okay's fine, he said. Okay gets you to good eventually.
She talked to him for another 20 minutes about nothing in particular. The warehouse, a movie he'd watched, a neighbor's dog that had apparently developed a personal vendetta against the mailbox. Ordinary things, the kind that held you in place when you needed holding. After she hung up, she sat in the quiet apartment and thought about what he'd said. You're allowed. Simple enough. Not a solution to anything, but accurate in the way that simple things sometimes were. She got up and ate dinner and went to bed and slept better than she had in 2 weeks. The dinner happened on a Wednesday evening, 12 days after Ethan's discharge. He had texted. One of the stranger adjustments of his recovery had been watching him relearn the rhythms of normal communication, texting and email and phone calls, the 1,000 small technological threads of a life that had been cut in November and needed rethreading. And he had been characteristically direct about it. Wednesday, if you're free. I know a place on Randolph. Nothing impressive, just food. She had looked at the text for about 30 seconds and then written back, Wednesday works. The restaurant was a small Italian place, not the kind with white tablecloths and ambient lighting designed to imply significance, but the real kind, cramped and warm and smelling of garlic and something that had been simmering for hours, with a handwritten specials board and a host who had the accent of someone for whom the food was a heritage rather than a concept. She arrived first, which she had intended to do, partly because she was always early and partly because she wanted to be settled before he got there, rather than navigating the particular awkwardness of an entrance. He arrived 7 minutes later. He was still thinner than his pre-stroke photographs, still moved with a deliberateness that would probably always be slightly different from before, the body's memory of what had happened to it. But he walked without any support, and his color was good, and he looked, she thought, like a man who had recently discovered that he was still alive and was cautiously deciding what to do about that. He sat down across from her. You're early. I'm always early. You knew that. I knew that, he agreed. The waiter came. They ordered, the waiter left. The ambient noise of a full restaurant settled around them. Other people's conversations, the clatter of the kitchen, someone's kid at the table near the door, asking loudly about breadsticks. This is strange, Amelia said. It is, Ethan agreed. You're not in a hospital bed. I'm very aware of that. And I'm not carrying a chart. I noticed. He looked at her across the table. Is it bad strange or just strange? She thought about it. Just strange. The kind that goes away once you get used to the new version of something. I can work with that. The food came. They ate. The conversation moved in a way that was different from the hospital and also continuous with it. The same quality of directness, the same absence of performance that had characterized every conversation in room 14. They talked about Sophie, who had apparently spent the first 2 days after his discharge redesigning the layout of his home office for reasons that were not entirely clear, but that Ethan had decided to accommodate because he'd been gone for 8 months, and Sophie was entitled to a few organizational opinions. They talked about Dr. Hale, who had cleared him for light work in increments that Ethan described as glacially conservative and that Amelia described as medically sound, and they talked about this with enough energy that the people at the adjacent table glanced over. She told him about her mother. Not the summary she gave people when the topic came up, but the actual version. Rosario Torres at 63, managing type 2 diabetes with the selective compliance of someone who had been independent for 40 years and found medical instruction to be at best a suggestion, who made the best tamales Amelia had ever eaten, and who called Amelia every Sunday morning at 8, regardless of what Amelia had been doing the night before, and who had, 3 months ago, looked at Amelia over the phone and said, You sound different lately, mija. You sound like you have something to think about. And Amelia had said, It's just work, Mom. And Rosario had made the sound she made when she was allowing something to go by without pushing on it, which was different from agreement. Ethan listened the way he always listened, without interrupting, without performing attention, just actually listening. What did you tell her? He asked. About Rosario. I told her it was work stuff. Was that true? Partially, she said. He nodded. She'll want to meet you, Amelia said, and then registered what she'd said and added, Eventually, if this becomes a thing that exists, I'd like to meet her, he said. No hesitation. She looked at him. You'd like to meet my mother? She raised you. She sounds formidable. Yes, I'd like to meet her. He said it simply, like it was obvious. I'd also like her recipe for tamales if that's on the table. Amelia stared at him. You're asking about tamale recipes. Priorities. She laughed. The laugh surprised her. She wasn't expecting to laugh. Not here, not at this particular moment that she'd been treating with such careful internal weight. But it came out anyway, real and slightly undignified, and she didn't try to pull it back. He was smiling across the table. The full version, the one that had taken weeks of physical recovery to get back, and that she had first seen properly on the evening she told him about the plant. Okay, she said, when she'd recovered. I'll ask her. The conversation that changed something, not dramatically, not with the narrative neatness of a scene in a film, but in the way real things shifted, incrementally and without fanfare, happened not at the restaurant but afterward, on the sidewalk outside, while they were waiting for her car service, and he had his hands in his pockets, and the July evening was warm enough that neither of them was in a hurry to move. I've been thinking about what you said, he told her. In the hospital. About the weights. Which part? That I had the weights wrong. Not that I'd forgotten what mattered, just that I'd put the work on one side and convinced myself it balanced. He looked down the street. I've been thinking about what balancing it actually looks like. Not in theory. In practice. And I'm restructuring things at the company. Not just cleaning up what Vincent did, actually restructuring, scaling back. There are 3 fund managers who can run the day-to-day without me in the middle of it. I've been making myself indispensable to a machine that didn't need me to be indispensable and calling it security. He paused. I've been thinking about what I want the company to be used for, if I'm not spending every day running it. She thought about what he wasn't quite saying. You're thinking about the healthcare program. He'd mentioned it once, in the hospital. A thought he'd had during the long months of silence about what it meant that his recovery was possible, partly because he could afford indefinite high-quality care. What it meant for the people who couldn't. I've been talking to some people, he said. Diana Cole has connections in the hospital network. Dr. Hale has opinions about what the gaps actually look like from the clinical side. A beat. I'd want your opinion too. She looked at him. My opinion. You've been doing this for 6 years in an underfunded system, he said. You know what's missing from the inside. I can look at the financial structure and figure out how to fund it, but I don't know what to fund. He met her eyes. I'm not asking you to work for me. I'm asking what you've seen that should exist and doesn't. She was quiet for a moment. She thought about the families she'd watched make impossible calculations. Whether to take time off work to be at a patient's side, whether they could afford the parking, whether the diagnosis meant the end of things they'd planned. She thought about patients who left the hospital before they were ready because insurance ran out. She thought about the nursing homes her floor sent people to and which ones she'd recommend if someone asked, and which ones she'd drive around a few extra blocks to avoid recommending. She thought about all of it and about the fact that someone was asking and that the someone had resources that matched the scale of the problem and that this was not a common intersection. I'll need to think about it properly, she said. Take time. But yes. She said it before she'd finished deciding, which was unlike her, but the answer had been there before she reached for it. Yes, I want to. He nodded. No celebration of it, just acknowledgement, the way he acknowledged things that mattered, without decorating them. The car arrived. They stood there for a moment. This wasn't too strange, he said. The dinner? All of it. She thought about the question. The restaurant and the tamale question and the conversation about her mother and the way he'd listened and the sidewalk and the question he'd just asked about what should exist and doesn't, and the 8 months before all of this, the room and the silence and the hand that closed around hers in the dark. No, she said. It wasn't too strange. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, Good. She got in the car. She didn't look back because she already knew his face well enough that she didn't need to. Mom. The dinner became 2 dinners, and then a Saturday afternoon where he picked her up in a car that was quiet and didn't smell like the Red Line, and they drove to a farmer's market on the north side that he had apparently been taking Sophie to for years before the stroke, because it was one of the things he wanted back and had said so without framing it as a significant thing. He hadn't been since before November. The vendors were different in July than in November, and some of the faces he recognized and some he didn't. and he walked through it with the careful deliberateness of someone relearning a route they'd known by instinct. Sophie came too. This had not been planned. Mrs. Hargrove had called at 9 that morning with an apologetic explanation about a family thing, and Ethan had mentioned it to Amelia in a tone that was offering her an exit if she wanted one. Sophie's coming along. It'll be more complicated. And Amelia had said, "I know, Sophie. It'll be fine." It was fine in the way that things with 7-year-olds were fine, which was to say it was chaotic and loud, and occasionally stopped dead while Sophie made extended executive decisions about whether the strawberries at the second stall were better than the strawberries at the fourth stall, which required sampling both, and then circling back to the first for comparison. "The second ones," Sophie announced finally, with the finality of a verdict. "The first ones tasted the same to me," Ethan said. Sophie gave him a look that was so precisely the look Amelia had seen on his face in hospital. That particular quality of patient contained skepticism, that she had to look away for a moment. "They're different," Sophie said. "The second ones are sweeter because they're redder. You need to look at them properly." "I looked at them." "You looked at them like you look at the news," Sophie said. "That's not properly." Amelia bought the second strawberries. Sophie accepted this as the correct decision. Ethan looked at Amelia with an expression that acknowledged, without quite saying so, that he had been outmaneuvered on his own turf by a 7-year-old. Later, while Sophie was investigating a stall that sold hand-painted ceramic animals with the intensity of a procurement specialist, Ethan stood beside Amelia with a coffee he'd bought from a cart and said quietly, "She likes you." "I like her," Amelia said. "She doesn't like everyone." "I know, she told me." She watched Sophie pick up a ceramic fox, examine it, put it down, pick it up again. "She told me in March that she thought most adults talked to kids in a stupid way and she preferred it when people just talked normally." "She said that?" "Word for word. She also said the hospital pudding was disappointing, but you weren't allowed to tell anyone because she didn't want to seem ungrateful." He shook his head slightly. "She's 7. "She's extremely 7, Amelia agreed. "It's a compliment." He was quiet for a moment. "I missed 8 months of her being 7. She heard the weight in it, not self-pity. Never that with him, just the plain fact of loss, stated without decoration. "She'll be 8 in September," Amelia said. "You won't miss that." He looked at his daughter, deciding about the ceramic fox. "No," he said, "I won't." The sun was doing what July sun did at a farmer's market, making everything look slightly more vivid than it actually was. The colors of the produce and the awnings and the crowd. Sophie bought the fox. She named it immediately, which she announced unprompted, Gerald. Her reasoning for this was unavailable but appeared firm. Walking back to the car, Sophie fell into step between them in the way children inserted themselves into the geometric center of the adults they were with, holding her fox in one hand and with the other tucked into the crook of Ethan's arm, and she talked about Gerald's probable life history and preferences. And Ethan listened with the same full attention he gave everything. And Amelia walked alongside them in the warm afternoon and thought about how long a road it had been from a silent room in November to this sidewalk in July. She thought about how roads like this didn't happen often, about what it cost to walk them and what it would have cost not to. She thought about the plant in the crack in the concrete, still alive, still finding the light from a strange angle. She was going to be okay. She had known that. She was going to be more than okay, she thought, and that was the thing she was still getting used to. Not the okay, but the more than, the unexpected possibility of it, the way it had arrived sideways when she wasn't looking in the form of 2 words from a man who had spent months learning to hear her and had finally found the way to say so. Sophie reached over without looking and took Amelia's hand too, the ceramic fox clutched between them, still talking about Gerald. Amelia held on. The legal case against Vincent Mercer concluded on a Thursday morning in late September, and the outcome was not dramatic the way legal outcomes sometimes were in films. No moment of visible reckoning in a courtroom, no confrontation in a hallway. Vincent's attorney submitted a settlement agreement that his client signed without appearing in person, and the $42 million began moving back through the financial structures it had traveled through in the wrong direction 9 months earlier. Ethan called Amelia from his office, his real office, the one in the Mercer Capitol building on Michigan Avenue, where he had returned on a reduced schedule in August, 2 days a week at first, then 3, then 4. Dr. Hale monitoring the pace with the vigilance of a man who had learned that his patient's relationship with limits was complicated. And he said, "It's done." She was on her lunch break, sitting on the bench outside the hospital entrance where nurses went when they needed 10 minutes of air. "The settlement? Signed this morning. The funds are in recovery. There will be ongoing legal proceedings, but they don't need me in the middle of them." A pause. "It's done." She heard what was underneath the words. Not triumph. Something quieter and less clean. The particular feeling of a thing being finished that you had been inside for so long that finishing it left a space you didn't know what to do with. "How do you feel?" she asked. "Tired," he said. "Mostly just tired." "That's honest." "I've been practicing." She heard him breathe out on the other end, and she pictured him in that office she'd never been to, standing at a window that probably had a better view than a concrete wall, looking out at Michigan Avenue in late September when the trees were starting to turn and the city was doing its complicated autumn thing. "Come for dinner tonight," she said. "My mother's making chicken with rice. It's not tamales, but it's good." A beat. "Your mother knows I'm coming?" "She's been expecting you for 2 months. She just hasn't said anything because she's playing it cool." "Is she good at playing it cool?" "She's terrible at it," Amelia said. "She cleaned the apartment twice this week and she told me it was for a general tidy. My mother does not do general tidies." He laughed. The laugh was easier now than it had been in July. It came out more fluidly, without that slight roughness of disuse, which Amelia noted the way she noted all his physical improvements, automatically and with the satisfaction she'd stopped trying to classify as purely clinical. 7 o'clock, he said. 6:30. She eats early, and she won't admit it. 6:30, he said. Tell her I'm looking forward to it. Tell her yourself, Amelia said. You'll have approximately 40 seconds before she starts asking you questions. Be ready. She hung up and sat for another 3 minutes on the bench with the September air on her face, and she thought about all the different shapes a year could take. November to September. From a conference room floor to a bench outside a hospital where she was on her lunch break, and the case was closed and dinner was at 6:30. All those months in between, the silence and the machines and the long haul back through the dark, and the light that had come not from any single dramatic moment, but from the accumulated weight of ordinary, patient, unglamorous showing up. She thought about what she knew now that she hadn't known in November when Sandra had set the reassignment paperwork on the counter beside her keyboard. She thought, not much, technically. She had just done the job. She had shown up and talked and paid attention and refused to treat a person like a body. And she had done it again the next day and the day after that and the day after that, because that was what the situation required, and she was someone who did what situations required. That was the whole of it. No mystery, no special gift. She thought, and yet. She went back inside. Tut. Rosario Torres was 63 years old, 4'11", and had lived in the same apartment on the south side for 22 years. She had diabetes, an impressive collection of opinions about how other people should live their lives, and a laugh that could fill a room the way sunlight filled a room. Not aggressively, but completely, reaching all the corners. She opened the apartment door before Ethan could knock because she had been watching the street from the window and saw his car pull up, which she later denied. He was carrying flowers, not the elaborate arrangements that wealth could purchase, but the practical kind from the shop on the corner, yellow and orange. The kind that looked like someone had actually chosen them rather than ordered them. He had taken Sophie's advice about this because Sophie had strong opinions about flowers and had said that big fancy ones look like you're trying too hard, but the little bright ones are honest, which Amelia had found philosophically sound for an 8-year-old. Sophie was right. Rosario's face did the thing that honest flowers did to the faces of practical women. Come in, Rosario said, taking the flowers without ceremony and examining them approvingly. You're thinner than your pictures. Mama, Amelia said. He is. That's not an insult. That's an observation. Come sit down. She waved Ethan toward the kitchen table as though he were someone she'd known for years and were mildly inconveniencing her by standing in the doorway. You want water? I have agua fresca. Please, Ethan said. Thank you. He sat at the kitchen table. The apartment was small and full, photographs on every surface, a crucifix above the door that Amelia glanced at automatically, and which was simply part of the room's geography without significance to the evening. plants on the windowsill in varying states of health, a television in the next room playing something at a low volume. The smell of chicken and rice and sofrito was so present it was almost a physical thing. Rosario put the flowers in water without fuss and set them on the counter, and then turned and looked at Ethan Mercer with the frank, uncomplicated assessment of a woman who had raised 2 children alone and had no patience left for anyone who wasn't who they said they were. "So," she said, "you're the one my daughter spent 3 months talking to when you couldn't talk back." "Mama." "He knows," Rosario said, not looking at Amelia, looking at Ethan. "I know," Ethan said. "And you want to take her to dinner and to farmers markets and now to meet the family?" "Yes." "Why?" "Because she's the most honest person I've ever met," he said, without pausing to calculate the answer. "And because I spent 8 months with nothing but time to think about what I'd been doing wrong. And one of the things I'd been doing wrong was not paying attention to the right people." He looked at Rosario steadily. "Your daughter paid attention to the right things when it was inconvenient and expensive and when nobody was watching. That's not common. I know that better than most people." Rosario looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned to the stove. "Dinner's in 20 minutes, she said. "Amelia, set the table." Amelia set the table. She caught Ethan's eye across the kitchen, and he had the expression of a man who had just passed a test he hadn't been certain about, which she thought was probably accurate. Dinner was chicken and rice, and a conversation that lasted 2.5 hours, which was not what Amelia had planned. Rosario asked about Sophie, not the polite questions people asked about other people's children, but the real questions, about what she was like, what she thought, whether she was doing okay after the year she'd had. Ethan answered those questions differently than he answered questions about the company or the legal proceedings, with a fullness that didn't require any management, because talking about his daughter didn't require anything to be performed. Marco called at 8:15, which was coincidental. Amelia answered because she always answered and because she wanted him to know this was happening, and he said, "Is that him? Is he there?" And she said, "Yes, don't." And he said, "Can I talk to him?" And she briefly considered this and then handed Ethan the phone because she had learned that trying to manage the Torres family's directness was a losing proposition. What followed was a 12-minute conversation between Ethan Mercer and Marco Torres that Amelia could only hear one side of, but which ended with Ethan saying, "Yeah, I can do that. Have her send me the resume on Monday," and handing the phone back to Amelia with the expression of someone who had been efficiently sorted by the universe. "What did you promise him?" she asked. He wants to move out of the warehouse job. He has a logistics background, and I need someone in operations who isn't already embedded in the old company culture." He said this evenly, like it was a reasonable thing that had happened. "I'm not promising him anything. I'm looking at the resume." "Ethan, he's your brother, and if he's qualified, I'm not doing anyone favors by not hiring him. That's just allocation of available resources." "You have a very corporate way of doing kind things," she said. "I'm working on it." "I know," she said. "You're getting better." "Oh." The announcement about the neurological recovery wing came in November. Ethan had been working on it since July, quietly, without press releases or advance coverage, with the specific deliberateness of someone who had decided what they wanted to do and was doing it rather than announcing the intention to do it. He had worked with Dr. Hale on the clinical gaps, with Diana Cole on the funding structure, with a small team of healthcare administrators that Amelia had helped him identify over the course of the summer. He had also worked with Amelia. Not formally, not as an employee. She had her job, which she kept, which she had never entertained leaving because the floor at St. Mary's was where she knew how to be useful, and she had no interest in trading competence for proximity to money. But she had talked with him specifically and at length about what was missing, about the families who fell through, about the months of unconscious care that most people couldn't afford to maintain, about the follow-up gaps that appeared when patients went home, about the particular loneliness of long-term recovery, which the medical system treated as a clinical matter and which was also, undeniably, a human one. He had listened the way he always listened. He had built what she described. The wing was 8 beds, purpose-built for long-term neurological recovery patients, with a funding structure that covered care for patients regardless of insurance status, a combination of the Mercer Capital Endowment and a partnership model with the hospital that Diana Cole had spent 4 months negotiating. It included a family support program, a social worker embedded in the care team, and a follow-up protocol that extended 6 months past discharge. It was not perfect. Ethan said so himself at the internal briefing with hospital administration that Amelia attended in her capacity as a clinical consultant, a title the hospital had created for the purpose and which she was still mildly suspicious of. "This is a first version," he said. "It has gaps we haven't identified yet, and it'll need to be adjusted based on what actually happens when it runs. I want a formal review at 6 months, and I want clinical staff driving that review, not administration."
Dr. Hale, sitting 2 seats down, made a note.
"Also," Ethan said, and his voice changed slightly, not more formal, but more careful, the way it got when he was saying something he'd prepared because he knew his tendency was to undersay things. "I want the naming to reflect what actually caused this to happen, which was not my money. My money is easy to give. It was there before November, and it'll be there after I'm gone." He looked at the papers in front of him, then up. "What caused this was a specific kind of attention that I couldn't have articulated a year ago and can now, and I want it named accordingly. He had told Amelia what he was planning. He had told her 2 weeks earlier at her kitchen table after Marco had finally moved out, and the apartment was quieter and they were eating leftover soup, and he had said, "I want to name it after you," and she had said, "Absolutely not." And he had said, "I know, I'm doing it anyway." And she had said, "Ethan," and he had said, "The name isn't for you, it's for the next nurse who needs to understand what the work is. It's a description, not a monument." She had thought about that for a long time. She hadn't found a good argument against it. What she had found instead was that she understood what he meant. It was the same thing she had been trying to articulate to herself for months. The difference between care as a technical function and care as a human one. The difference between a body being maintained and a person being present. The name on the wall wasn't going to mean anything to most people who walked past it. But for the nurses who worked in those rooms, for the patients who lay in those beds, for the families who sat in the chairs at 2 a.m. holding hands that couldn't squeeze back, for those people, the name was a statement of intent. It was a promise about what this place would try to be. She understood that. She didn't tell him she understood it. She let him do it. So, the morning of the unveiling was a Saturday in mid-November, 13 months almost exactly from the night Ethan had collapsed in that conference room on the 42nd floor. The ceremony was not elaborate. Ethan had been specific about this. No press event, no donor gala, no occasion that would center the giving rather than the purpose. Hospital staff, the clinical team, Dr. Hale. Amelia's mother, who had received a formal invitation delivered by hand and had dressed for it accordingly. Marco, who was 3 weeks into his new position in Ethan's operations team and still slightly stunned about it. Sophie, who was wearing a dress she had described as fine, I guess, and carrying Gerald the ceramic fox in her coat pocket. They gathered in the new corridor on the 3rd floor, a different section from room 14, which still existed, which was currently occupied by a patient Amelia was not assigned to but checked on anyway, because she checked on all of them. The corridor was clean and well lit, with windows that looked out on an actual courtyard rather than a concrete wall, and the doors to the 8 rooms had been painted a color that someone in facilities had described as warm white, and which was, genuinely, warmer than the institutional standard. At the end of the corridor, mounted on the wall at eye level, was the plaque. It was not large. Ethan had been deliberate about the size, too. Not a statement, not a monument. Just a name, and beneath it, in smaller text, a sentence he had written and rewritten 6 times before he thought he had it right. Amelia read it from across the corridor before they reached it. She read it, and she stopped walking, and she stood there in the middle of the hallway with her mother on one side and Ethan just behind her left shoulder, and she read it again. The Amelia Torres, Patient Humanity Center. And beneath, in smaller text, for the belief that being heard is part of being healed. The hallway was quiet, except for the ordinary sounds of a hospital. The distant beeping of monitors, a cart rolling somewhere, someone's phone. The sound she'd been hearing for 7 years and would keep hearing, she imagined, for a long time to come. She felt her mother take her hand. She felt Sophie insert herself between her left side and Ethan's right, with the practiced ease of someone who had been finding the geometric center of these 2 people for 4 months. She did not cry, which surprised her, and also did not surprise her because she was not someone who cried at the things she'd built, only at the things she'd lost. This was not a loss. This was a long way from a loss. "You spelled my name right," she said finally. She heard Ethan make a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was close. "I had help." Sophie proofread it, Sophie confirmed from the center position, twice, because the first person spell-checked it spelled Torres with one R. She sounded deeply aggrieved about this on Amelia's behalf. "Thank you, Sophie." "You're welcome. I also suggested the font, but no one listened." "What font did you want?" Marco asked from somewhere behind them. "Something nicer," Sophie said. "This one is fine, but it's a little boring." "The font is dignified," Ethan said. "Boring and dignified are sometimes the same," Sophie said. Rosario made a sound of pure, delighted approval. "She's right," she told Ethan. "You raised a smart one." "I had help," Ethan said again, and this time he meant something different, and Amelia knew exactly what he meant. And she did not say anything about it because she was still standing in front of the plaque and reading it a third time, and thinking about all the strange, unmappable routes that led people to the places they ended up. She went to work. This was the part that people who heard the story, and people did hear pieces of it, the way pieces of things always leaked out through the hospital network and the news coverage and the general osmosis of a city paying attention. This was the part people found hardest to understand. That after the plaque and the corridor and everything that had been built, Amelia Torres went back to her floor, put on her scrubs, picked up her chart, and went to work. She did not leave St. Mary's. She was offered things: consulting positions, speaking invitations, a profile in a healthcare publication that she declined politely and specifically. She stayed on the floor, she took her assignments, she did her rounds. What had changed was visible to people who paid attention and invisible to people who didn't. It was visible in the way she trained the newer nurses, two of whom she had taken on as informal mentees in the fall, young women who were good at the clinical work and still learning how to be present without being consumed by it, which was the hardest balance and the one that took the longest. She talked to them the way she wished someone had talked to her at 24, directly, without softening the difficult parts, but also without the world weariness that masqueraded as wisdom. She told them that the unglamorous work was the real work, that showing up consistently in a room where nothing seemed to be happening was not wasted effort, that patients who couldn't respond to you were still inside there, and the quality of your presence mattered, and this was not sentiment. It was clinical reality that the research was increasingly supporting and that experienced nurses had known for years before anyone studied it. She said it like she meant it, because she did. Derek, who had been watching all of this from a medium distance with the expression of someone revising a long-held position, stopped her in the break room one afternoon in December. "You should teach," he said, "formally, not just the informal stuff." "I'm a floor nurse," she said. "You're a floor nurse who's changed how 3 of our newer staff think about patient interaction in 6 months. He said it in the flat, factual tone he used when he was trying to deliver a compliment without it turning into a conversation about emotions. "That's a skill. You should use it." She thought about it. She told him she'd think about it, and she meant it, which was different from the polite version of that phrase. She was still thinking about it in January when she walked into a room, not room 14, a different room on the 4th floor, a transfer she'd picked up when their regular nurse called out sick, and found a woman lying in a coma following a car accident on the I-90 outside the city. No visitors, no flowers. The nurse's note said she had family in Indiana who had been notified and were having trouble getting to Chicago because of weather and logistics, and the kinds of obstacles that piled up on ordinary people at the worst moments. The woman's name was Patricia, 44 years old. A teacher, it said in the intake form under occupation. The kind of information that didn't belong in a medical chart, but that mattered. Amelia stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at the room, the monitors beeping, the IV lines, the particular stillness of someone who was somewhere that wasn't here, somewhere inside that nobody else could reach. She pulled the chair close to the bed and sat down. "Hi," she said. "My name is Amelia Torres. I'll be taking care of you today." She settled back in the chair, the same way she had settled into the chair in room 14 22 months ago, the first day she walked in and told Ethan Mercer she was going to talk at him whether he liked it or not. "I know you probably can't hear me, but I'm going to talk anyway." She talked. She talked about the weather. There was a cold front coming down from the north,
and the weekend forecast was for 6 to 8 inches, which the city would handle with the competent resignation it applied to all winter precipitation. She talked about the view from the fourth-floor window, which was better than the third floor's concrete wall. She talked about the family that was coming, that they were trying, that the roads were bad, but they were coming. She stayed until her shift ended. Before she left, she made a note in the chart, the first entry of what she intended to be a detailed daily log of all the small things she observed, all the indicators that didn't fit into checkboxes but might matter. She wrote it with the same careful attention she had written Ethan's chart 2 years ago, when Derek had told her she was burning herself out, and she had thought, that's how it's supposed to work. She still thought that. She had just added something to it. She thought, and sometimes it gives something back. On a Saturday morning in February, Ethan and Amelia took Sophie to the farmer's market. It was the winter iteration, smaller, mostly root vegetables and preserved things and vendors who had decided that year-round commitment was worth the cold. Sophie found this philosophically interesting and said so. She was wearing a hat that she had chosen herself and that appeared to have ears, and she was carrying Gerald in her coat pocket, which was still his established position on outings. They walked. Sophie argued about the relative merits of different root vegetables with a level of conviction that her teachers at school would probably have appreciated directed at something more academic. Ethan bought coffee from the same cart as always. Amelia bought the strawberry jam she'd been buying since October when the last fresh strawberries had been replaced by preserved ones, because the woman who made it had the particular small producer pride of someone whose product was genuinely excellent, and Amelia found that satisfying to support. It was ordinary. It was so ordinary that someone watching them move through the winter market, the man with the coffee and the careful, deliberate walk, the woman with the jam and the easy observational attention, the child with the ear hat, and the ceramic fox and the strong opinions about produce, would not have known any of it, would not have known about November, about the conference room floor, about a room on the third floor of a hospital, where someone lay in silence for 7 months while the world made its calculations. Would not have known about the machines and the darkness and the 2 words that came out of that darkness like something that had been stored too long in the wrong kind of place. I heard. Would not have known about the long road back, the 38 steps, the first laugh, the plant growing in the crack of a concrete wall, the almost smiles becoming real ones, the hand that reached in the dark and found something to hold. People moved around them without knowing any of it. That was fine. That was how it was supposed to be. The things that mattered most were rarely visible to people who hadn't been inside them. Sophie stopped at a stall and made a sound of intense interest. "They have ceramic animals here too," she announced, looking at Amelia with the expression of someone who understood that this was information requiring follow-up. "Gerald might want a friend," Amelia said. Sophie looked at the animals, looked at Gerald, whose head was visible above her pocket, made the careful, executive assessment that Amelia had come to recognize as her default mode of engaging with the world. "He would need to approve it himself," she said seriously. "He has opinions." "Bring him out," Ethan said. "Let him look." Sophie extracted Gerald from her pocket and held him up to examine the array of ceramic animals. She moved him slowly along the row, which the vendor watched with the tolerant amusement of someone who had seen stranger things at a winter market. Gerald stopped. Sophie stopped him, in front of a small ceramic owl, brown and round and slightly cross-looking. "That one," Sophie said. "Why that one?" Amelia asked. Sophie considered. "Because Gerald looks like he's waiting for something," she said, "and the owl looks like it's already decided. They balance." Amelia looked at the owl. She looked at Gerald. She looked at Sophie, who was 8 years old and had survived a terrible year and come out the other side with opinions about ceramic animals and strawberry quality and font choices and what balanced and what didn't. She thought, that tracks. She bought the owl. Walking back to the car with Sophie between them, the ear hat slightly crooked now, and both ceramic animals riding in her pockets, Sophie reached up and took both their hands the way she had been doing since July, without ceremony, without making a thing of it, the way children claimed the things they'd decided belonged to them. Amelia held on. Ethan looked over Sophie's head at her, and she looked back, and the thing that passed between them was not a movie moment. It was not scored or lit for significance. It was just 2 people who had found each other through the most unlikely and unglamorous of circumstances.
through machines and silence and terrible vending machine coffee and 38 steps down a hospital hallway, looking at each other in ordinary February light and knowing, without needing to say so, that the knowing was enough. The wind came off the lake the way it always did in February, cold and without apology. Sophie complained about it. Ethan adjusted his scarf. Amelia pulled her coat tighter and thought about Patricia in the room on the 4th floor, and about the family that had made it from Indiana and was there now, and about the 2 nursing students who were starting their rotation next week and whom she had a lot to tell. She thought, tomorrow. She thought there is always tomorrow's work. And she walked to the car between the man who had come back from somewhere very far away and the 8-year-old who had waited for him with homemade cookies and better-than-average stubbornness. And the city went on around them, cold and enormous and indifferent in the way that cities were. And she did not mind the indifference one bit. She had her people. That was the whole of it. That was, she had learned more than enough.